On behalf of Cogeco, the presenting partner of the Toronto Global Forum, welcome to the session. As representative of the North American Telecommunications and Media Company, I've been looking forward to this plenary session about financing green infrastructure, a topic that is crucial to the new economy. Building healthy communities, strengthening environmental stewardship, and ensuring broad inclusion are keys to our future. And we all have to participate in that. We all have responsibilities. As we build more reliable and sustainable economies, we can see opportunities to improve our approach, to be more inclusive, and to take care of the sustainability, environmental, and social and corporate governance issues and put them at the forefront of our priorities. And as I said, the private sector has a role to play here, and we can become examples of good corporate citizenship. For example, we at Cogeco build and invest in networks, playing a critical role in driving a green economy. Addressing climate changes and supporting our path to a net zero economy will require investment. Locally, the Government of Canada has committed to reaching that goal by 2050 and has created an $8 billion net zero accelerator fund. And we in industry can take action. Many questions remain unanswered. You have a good conversation back there? Sounds interesting. Many questions remain unanswered, such as appropriate monitoring and reporting measures, building business cases in a consistent manner, and avoiding greenwashing. So this plenary session will hopefully provide some of the answers for us. It is moderated by Mr. Phil DeLuna, expert in sustainability at McKinsey and Company. The panel will take a deep look at many of the issues and ideas around financing green infrastructure and how these ideas will help create a more integrated, responsible, and sustainable capitalism. Mr. DeLuna is joined by Mr. Macky, partner at and president of the infrastructure group of the Carlyle Group, Mr. Javier Pérez Fortea, president and CEO of Globalvia, and John Beck, of course, founder and chairman of the Aecon Group. So on behalf of Cogeco, I hope you enjoy this session. Have a great day, and thank you.
Wonderful. We have a wonderful panel this morning. On stage, we have the construction of green infrastructure, the financing of green infrastructure, and the operation of green infrastructure. So I'm going to dive right into it. For everyone in the room, green it can mean different things to many different people. So I'd like to first ask, what does green infrastructure mean to you and your organization, and what exactly are you doing to advance it? Macky, we'll start with you.
Yes, sure, Phil. I think that green infrastructure, it's a definition that is expanding. And from the perspective of my organization, I would first like to start by mentioning that Carlyle, the Carlyle Group has been one of the very first large PE group to take a commitment to net zero 2050. We did this at the beginning of this year, and we are making many efforts across our hundreds of portfolio companies towards that important goal. In terms of the definition of green infrastructure, I was mentioning that it is expanding because traditionally we've been thinking about power generation, renewable, so wind and solar. Those two are going to remain the biggest portion of a sector that will require meaningful investments over the next few years. But we should also think about it in terms of energy storage. The cost of renewable energy has been fast declining over the last decade or so, but it remains intermittent. So energy storage in the form of batteries is an important component. Smart grids are beginning to play more of a role when you think about investments at the community, industrial, residential level that are increasing. When you talk about newer sector and technologies, carbon capture, storage. So it is expanding and will continue to expand as we tackle this climate challenge.
That's an excellent point. The definition of green is continuing to expand because the solutions that we need for net zero touches every part of and every sector of our economy. So by nature, that needs to expand as well. Yeah. Javier, please, what does green mean to you and your organization?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Green is complicated in an organization such as mine. Globalvia specializes in building and operating toll highways and subway and tram and operating even high-speed rail. By definition, non-green infrastructure. So nowadays, and with that expansion, which is definitely happening in the term of green, we are in the phase of being sustainable to begin with. Sustainable is extremely important because it's what's going to lead to totally green infrastructure in the future. We at Globalvia have been named by one of the largest indexes that measure sustainability in companies. We've been declared for the 4th year in a row #1 in the world for infrastructure operators, for road infrastructure operators, which is great, but still needs to evolve more. I mean, that sustainability has to become green, but with technologies that are being developed nowadays, technologies that don't still exist and that we're hoping will exist soon. Globalvia is not only investing in this type of infrastructure, but we're investing in infrastructure that today could be already considered green, which is, for example, drones and vertiport construction for those drones in the future. Obviously, drones are electric, or not obviously, but as a matter of fact, they're being developed as electric vehicles. And not only are they going to be charged with renewable energy, but they are also less noisy, so which is another way of pollution, or non-polluting, which is silent transportation. So we're working on the development of those new green infrastructures and making our existing infrastructures more and more green and definitely sustainable for now.
That's great. And I like to highlight as well that green also has follow-on effects for health, for example. So the fact that you're promoting green infrastructure in the sense of trying to lower emissions also lowers noise pollution, also helps to decrease particulate matter and health outcomes together. So again, another example of how a definition of green is expanding. John, I'd like to go to you now. Green infrastructure, what does it mean to you and your organization?
So we're at the low end of the value chain. We build the infrastructure that these guys operate or invest in and develop. So we are, as a culture in the company, thinking about sustainability every step of the way, whether it be the materials that we use. For example, we're looking at experimenting with low carbon concretes, which have dramatically less emissions. On the equipment side, you talked about drones, which we use as well, but we are experimenting now with electric excavation equipment. It's early days, but we're doing that. We're also thinking about the entire process of producing electricity, and have developed skills in geothermal and the ability to use the heat from underground to be able to heat. We've created an entire community in Canada called Springwater, hundreds of houses, all based on geothermal. And we've also instilled a culture in the company, which is every step of the way, every step of the construction process, sustainability is always in the foreground. We've issued a couple of annual sustainability reports, and we'll continue to do that. So it's in the details. We see it all really as a business opportunity. It's not just we have to do it, but how do we benefit from that at the same time?
I really like the framing of looking at it as a business opportunity. We understand that we have to limit our emissions if we have any chance of reaching net zero by 2050, which we need to do if we have any chance of avoiding the worst impacts of global warming. And traditionally, green and sustainable investing have been thought of as compliance measures or as things that you have to do. But now we're increasingly seeing, with the advent of new technologies, new business models, the cooperation between operators, financiers, and builders, that it's actually about this transition where opportunity and profit will actually come as well. So one of the things that I've noticed in green infrastructure, lots of folks want to support green infrastructure. They want to lower their emissions, especially from a portfolio perspective. However, the most emissions come from the most heavy emitting things. Construction and infrastructure being a part of that. So maybe I'll start with you, Macky, on this question. People are thinking now about brown to green transition, where you intentionally invest in a heavy emitting asset with the intent of decarbonizing it, either shutting down the operations that are heavy emitting, helping to include or promote new technologies that will help it decarbonize, or completely transitioning it to a new business model entirely. What are your thoughts on the brown to green transition and the fact that we have to actually increase our emissions from a portfolio perspective before we can decrease them? Is that something that worries you?
Phil, you raise a very important question, which is that, as you've mentioned, the planet faces this existential challenge, which is why we need to succeed with energy transition. And where your question is important is that I have a sense that a lot of people have forgotten that it is a transition. In other words, from a carbon-heavy industry and world we are to a net zero one, that transition will not happen overnight with the blink of an eye. And so for that reason, what we have seen in the last few years is a significant commitment to the low end of the carbon economy, investing in low carbon assets, low carbon energy, renewable energy. That is the first part. And it is important to do that. And it's going to be possibly the most significant investment opportunity and effort. And so that needs to continue to be maximized. But the other end of the transition is also handling where the carbon is. And from an investor point of view, what we have seen is divestment. And the issue is that divesting reduces carbon emission from this carbon-heavy asset on paper. But all you've done is move these assets possibly to less responsible hands. And so we believe at Carlyle that we need to invest, not divest into the transition, which means doing the hard work, going into where carbon intensive assets are on the energy or industrial sector, and then use our resources, financial, technical expertise to help these companies improve their footprint. And it is by working at both ends of the spectrum that we will be able to have a successful transition. And I think that's very much in line with what Javier was saying earlier, in the businesses that they operate, that they are applying technologies and best practices to apply that. And that's very much the way in which we think about it.
I think it's fascinating how there was this movement to divest, and there were some actions to take that, but now the research is coming back and showing that actually divestment doesn't necessarily lead to lower emission outcomes.
It doesn't, but even worse than that, what we are seeing is that there hasn't been investment on the higher end of, if you look at the energy supply, there has been such capital draw that it has now affected security of supply. It has led to some degree of imbalance in supply and demand, higher energy prices that are actually affecting low-income families and regions of the world. And the irony of it is that you look at a country like Germany, even if that situation in Europe has been exacerbated by the unique situation of the war in Ukraine. But Germany this year has been burning more coal than they ever have, which has meaningful impact not only on carbon emissions, but also on other harmful emissions. And so, again, a good indication of the need to continue to invest in a responsible way through the transition.
I appreciate that perspective. And Javier, I'll turn to you now. From the perspective of someone who is looking to actually finance some of the projects and the operations within your company, how do you go to market? How do you go to the folks who want to finance green infrastructure? What makes it compelling and competitive? And how do you ensure that you are sort of industry leading in that way?
That's a very complicated question because there's no answer to that question. This transition that we're talking about to green sustainable infrastructure doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't happen because we invest in greener infrastructure, if that definition could work. It happens because things change. The world changes. The ideas that people have and want for the future change, and everything has to fall into place. So we cannot think about a sustainable road if everybody has to be at work at 8 o'clock in the morning. But society is evolving, and nowadays people are freer to arrive at 9 and then leave later, or even stay home and work from home, which particularly I don't like. By the way, I don't like teleworking. I think the teams work better when they see each other face to face. But when all this changes, all this, I would say, when the ideas of people change about what is more important, then you can start evolving and you can start creating this transition. Okay, for example, G5. Or 5G will be extremely important in these infrastructures in the future, because a road will be more sustainable if there's no traffic jams on top of the road. So if people can make it to town at different times, or if you are informed of what is happening on the road, then you can avoid the road and you can avoid those traffic jams, which will create less pollution in the end. So it's extremely important to know that the conditions of society are changing, and that is allowing infrastructure to become greener in a way. But there's still a lot of research needed for this transition to happen. The main way in which sustainable infrastructure will go forward is if governments start asking for these different solutions, including big data, 5G, like I was saying, vehicles talking to the infrastructure. If the governments that tender the projects for infrastructure do include this in the tender papers, then there's going to be a big jump in sustainable infrastructure. Nowadays, mainly funds, infrastructure funds, pension funds, and banks are the ones pushing for infrastructure to be green before it's financed or acquired.
That's interesting. So a couple of things.
I could just pick up on that.
Yeah, please, go ahead, John.
The procurement models by government today do not evaluate sustainability aspects of whatever the proposals are, for a variety of different reasons. It's a softer subject, a little harder to measure. Governments look for the cheapest price very often, and so they're worried about these things increasing prices. But I think there has to be increasing pressure, you're right, on governments to include sustainability as part of its evaluation process when it awards. If I could just pick up on culture as well that you talked about. I'll give you small examples of culture in our organization, again, at the low end of the food chain. So it's become cultural that when you're using construction equipment and you need to stop for a few minutes, historically it just idled, now gets turned off, and it's monitored, so it will be turned off. Recycling is another example. When we used to dig up dirt or break old concrete, everything, the first thought is, how can I recycle this? Where can I reuse this? Reinforcing steel as well. So it's a cultural difference. It's not just a rules-based or a measurement-based. It's just the way every employee thinks.
I really appreciate how a few things here. First, the solution isn't just one thing, but rather a combination, a cross-sectoral, taking new technologies, and governments, who typically are the ones who ask for these infrastructure projects, aren't necessarily accustomed to thinking about sustainability, new technologies, pushing that innovation landscape. And the second piece on that is not only does it have to be a combination and cross-sectoral solution, but it also has to come from the bottom up. It has to be culture-driven. And we can manage everything we want. We can try to measure in order to do that. But ultimately, it's the sum of these small actions that will create the impact down the road. John, I'll turn to you. Please,
say
yes.
something on that. Totally right, Phil. And that is one of the problems. You can have different regions in the world, countries, or doing the right thing and doing that transition to green. And if you have other countries next to that country not doing the same thing, it seems like it's worthless. We still have to keep fighting, even if and that happens all the time, unfortunately. But we still have to keep pushing, and we have to try to get that culture onto everybody, not just the countries that are working on this, but also on other countries that are not giving any, or the people in the country are not, they're doing things that we might all think that doesn't happen anymore, like fishing with dynamite and things like that, and those things still happen. So yes, we need to get those isolated actions to expand throughout the world by culturally getting everybody to acknowledge that it's a must. I mean, we need to preserve the earth.
Mm-hmm. And that's why having this conversation is so important. Being on stage and seeing all of you, titans in your field, speak it with such conviction and passion about this. I think anyone in the room would know that this is important. John, I'll turn to you now. We've heard about the need to finance, the need to operate. Who's going to build all this stuff? Do we have the labor force to do it? We're talking about drones and 5G and carbon capture. These are entirely new technologies, new industries, new markets that have yet to been tapped. Do we have the workforce to do that? And what can we do to train that generation to do it?
So no, the answer is we do not have the workforce to do that today. There's a shortage, I think, worldwide today of skilled trades, construction workers. So what are we doing? Multiple things. So obviously we have training in-house and trying to bring people up. We have training of women. We have training of indigenous groups, less advantaged groups. We've created joint ventures with indigenous groups. We've created joint ventures with less disadvantaged youth in certain parts of the country, where we, together with them, first of all, we train them to be able to work with us. But second, we teach them that it's not just about the job, it's also about making money at the job. And so they share in the profits of that. So it's a training not only of the skills, but a training of the mentality that goes along with construction. We also have a push for technology wherever we can use it to reduce the amount of physical activity and labor that it needs. Drones is a very good example of that. We work with unions and we work with governments for training programs as well. Immigration in Canada will help. It will add value and hopefully bring skilled workers in addition from around the world.
And also hopefully they'll be inspired by, the mission to help decarbonize these industries. I'm going to ask a question to all three of you now. On the role of governments in public-private partnerships. We spoke a little bit already about in the tender offer and having that front and center. But from each of your perspectives, and Macky, I'll start with you. When you're looking at potentially investment in green infrastructure, and how do you think about public-private in that? How do you think about government, either whether that's government regulation, government support, work, economic prosperity? How does that calculus go into that investment decision?
Well, a few comments there, Phil. Number one, there is so much to do, and as we were discussing over the next few years, that pace of investment will need to accelerate. And that means that both the government and the private sector have a role to play to be able to meet that challenge. In terms of capital, resources, efforts, it's going to have to be an all hands on deck. In a more concrete way, I was mentioning earlier how the cost of renewable energy has been declining. And there you can pinpoint to the role of government to help really accelerate some of these technological trends. You look at, for example, the Obama administration with their PTC, their credit over a decade ago, help the industry invest and innovate. And more recently, we're now seeing other programs such as the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which are committing meaningful capital into 5G infrastructure in the US, into traditional sectors, but also into accelerating green sector, climate change, and those types of incentive, which also exist in Europe, in Canada. They play an important role if you think about the newer technologies that are where renewable energy was over a decade ago. If you think about carbon capture and storage technology, if you think about hydrogen technologies. So that's where there is a role to play. But I do see for us meaningful investment opportunities independently of these programs, which do help accelerate. We were talking about many corporations taking net zero 50 commitments. Those organizations, to be able to meet that goal, go out and actually contract for across their supply chain to be able to meet that. And they're also driving some of these investment opportunities. So short answer is that both the government and the private sector are essential and have a key role to play. And yes, government have to work to help accelerate this investment and the opportunity.
I think it's important to note that governments, their role is really giving that signal, that catalyst, that first spark. And then it's the private sector that then takes it and says, okay, we move.
We do, and in my opinion, I do think that, I mean, Carlyle is an asset manager. We invest in private assets across the globe and the economy. And I think that the investment opportunity over the next many years around the energy transition and the objective to meet the climate challenge 2050 is across sector likely going to be the most significant and attractive investment opportunity. And it is a sector of priority for us.
Thank you. Javier, you spoke and you gave the excellent example of tender offers and incorporating sustainability into those tender offers when the governments everywhere should be doing that. What more, in your opinion, should governments be doing or can be doing that they're not doing now in order to support green infrastructure? Okay,
I'm going to say something that might seem like a contradiction in terms, but governments should subsidize less.
Interesting.
And I'm saying that because of companies like ours. I mean, there's funds out there. There's funds to build infrastructure. People talk about the infrastructure gap normally, about all this infrastructure needed to be built, but not enough cash. Well, that's wrong. There's no gap. The cash is there. It just has to be able to get to the project. The project has to have the risks perfectly distributed between the grantors and the concessionaires or the construction companies, and that doesn't happen. So what happens when a project is ultra subsidized? you give access to that project, to that tender, to that award, to companies that are not really prepared, but it's easy because there's no need for cash. Everything comes from the government. So governments, and in Canada, it's a special example of that. As train projects, for example, light rail, it's highly subsidized. So any medium-sized company could access without being a company that is really working on sustainability like other larger companies. So what governments need to do is subsidize less and enforce sustainability measures in the project when it's being tendered or when it's being designed for tender.
It's interesting. I think both of those perspectives are correct, but in different parts of the supply chain. So I hear what you're saying, which is governments need to subsidize less once you have a mature technology, and the competition between the firms are not commodified, but a little bit more certain. Whereas, Macky, I think you're saying for new technologies that have yet to be, the solar investment tax credit, production tax credit as an example, really help to stimulate a market, and then when it's still young. John, I'll ask you, what are your thoughts? Do you think the government should subsidize more and less? And if so, at what point of that supply chain?
Well, the argument the government will give you each time is our money is cheaper than your money. We can borrow at lower rates, call it subsidizing, call it contributing to the financing of the project. It's a question of finding the right balance. I'm with you, Javier. I think they should do less because I think that our ability to bring financing, although it may be slightly more expensive, will be more than compensated by our efficiency, by our commitment, by the fact we have a lump sum price which we have to honor and a schedule which we have to deliver to. So I think that there's a balance. If you look at the history of public-private partnerships in Canada over the last 30 years or so, it started as a very exciting experiment. It then became accepted. It then became very successful. And then it got more and more complicated. What was initially hospitals, greenfield projects, morphed into brownfield projects, or projects where there were extreme risks surrounding the project which could not be evaluated. And that made the reality of public-private partnerships questionable and complicated and politically sensitive. And so, as Minister Mulroney said earlier, through the organization that develops infrastructure in Ontario, Metrolinx, they came up with an idea which is called progressive design build, while at the same time working toward a public-private partnership and lump sum and schedule, but after eliminating a lot of the risks that are inherent in the project through this progressive design build. So it's a modified public-private partnership, and I think it works. And the idea here is to constantly evolve as we develop and as we reach new technology capabilities and new ideas in transit, for example. Driverless transit, which we're seeing more and more of, as an example. Those things, as long as there's adaptability by governments to the model for procurement, I think we're in the right direction.
That's great. I really appreciate the kind of framing of the history of how public-private partnerships have evolved. What started off with good intent and seemed to work really well for certain aspects, when applied to a broad range of things, didn't work as well. And I think that's one of the issues that we're seeing with the green transition in general. There is no silver bullet. You can't just take something and then expect all of the emissions to go down. It requires a very specific determination of the risks to that project, to that jurisdiction, to that technology. So I want to move on now actually into a question around risks and challenges and also opportunities around green infrastructure. And I'll phrase it this way. What do you think, and I'll start with you, Macky, what do you think is the single biggest barrier to us actually achieving the goals that we need to in green infrastructure? And how do we address it?
I think there are quite a few of them, so limiting to one is a challenge. As I was saying, there is meaningful investment that needs to go into the space. As Javier was saying, capital is available, so there is a challenge for structuring. I mean, if I was to pinpoint what I see in the current environment, and it is somewhat related to your question earlier about labor, I would worry about supply chain in a world that is deglobalizing. And so there will be exploding demand on key components. If you look at what goes into solar panel, into their fabrication, into lithium, into what goes into, as an example, electric vehicles, into battery charging systems. So these are going to be in high demand. And there is a concern on the capacity of the supply chain globally to be able to meet that meaningful demand. I think that's a very important area that we will need to focus on. And from our perspective, when we invest, as we do across all of these sectors, we focus very much in each of our investments into that aspect of and being able to manage, procure it properly. That's a big challenge. If I may just stretch to a second one, which you referred to earlier, which is also very important. You were talking about measuring. And there is a big challenge today in the lack of uniformity standard around all of these efforts on what measuring the actual impact when you shift from high carbon to lower carbon, when you go, as you were saying earlier, from gray to green. How do you measure that impact on a durable and comparable basis? And that is an important question that we will need to tackle. Because as we all know, what gets measured actually gets compared, benchmarked, and improved. And this is something that at Carlyle, we actually have launched a very concrete initiative to help fix. It's called the ESG Data Convergence Initiative. And what we did was, among the GPs like ourselves and our investors, LPs, we said, let's try and put the data together in a way that with scale, we can actually compare and measure critical ESG data that can be related to carbon, to board diversity, to job creation, and things of that nature. And really proud to say that, barely a year after we launched this initiative, we now have over 215 GPs and LPs that have joined this effort, which we launched with CalPERS. Carlyle and CalPERS launched it. And those 215 GPs and LPs represent over 22 trillion, over 2,000 companies. So we're really beginning to have a coherent, comparable set of data to be able to do that measuring, that benchmarking. We're very excited about what's to come with that initiative.
No, I appreciate that. You highlighted a challenge, and now you also highlighted a solution to that challenge. And it's actually so true how, you hear about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and now scope 4, avoided emissions. Being able to understand, and not only does that increase a reliability, but it also increases credibility with the industry, and it helps to fight greenwashing. Because there are some firms out there that will say that they're reducing emissions, but when you dive down deep into it, are they really? Are they just taking it off their books? Are they just divesting and not driving real world emissions down? Yeah.
I completely agree. The only way to actually drive concrete reduction is doing the hard job where the carbon is in the real world, in actually investing in these assets, cleaning them up. And by the way, to your point earlier about gray to green, there is a financial arbitrage opportunity once you successfully transition that, which we see as a combination of doing the right thing, but also making attractive investment for our clients.
Right. Javier, challenge and opportunity.
I think the challenge is getting everybody together to do what we need to do. Getting countries to agree with each other, getting politicians to negotiate, agree, and sustain the agreements. And then measuring, like you were saying earlier, it's almost impossible at this point in time unless we standardize and we're able to measure, to compare, to benchmark. It's going to be extremely difficult. During the pandemic, the scientists in the world got together and vaccines started popping up all over the place because everybody was working for the same thing. Everybody was working to do the same thing. With the environment, we still haven't been able to do that. And for example, we work in countries in which if we were to look at the emissions of our subcontractors, of our supply chain, it would be impossible to find somebody to do what we need to do because none of them are looking into this yet. So I think the biggest challenge is going to be getting the standardized procedures and standard requirements to be imposed, but that every country in the world decides to follow. And that is extremely complicated, I think.
Thank you. John.
Technology, time, and money. So technology, I mean, if we look at low carbon concrete, for example, that's something that's in progress. Equipment that will be more and more electric, which is not, that's in progress and takes time. And both need technological improvements and may require money in the sense of higher cost. You just picked up on something that I was thinking about when you mentioned that your subcontractors in various countries don't even understand the idea of sustainability. They're more about getting the job done and that's it. I think politics in certain countries around the world are a challenge because they're not putting sustainability as one of their priorities yet. Yes, it's something that they consider, but it's not a priority. And I'm not talking about the Western countries necessarily, but a lot of the large emitters around the world. And so that is going to require pressure from within. It's going to require politics to make those things happen. And as more and more of humanity feels the need, I think that'll accelerate as well.
Well, I could be speaking with the three of you for hours on this topic, but alas, we're running at the end of this session. I wanted to thank you all for your perspectives today, and I'm sure with all of the work that you're doing, we're going to get some way there. So thank you so much, and please join me in thanking our panelists.